Muy buenos días, sean todos muy bienvenidos al webinar de lanzamiento público del Observatorio de Buenas Prácticas Regulatorias en la
Welcome everyone to the
Regulación
webinar on best regulatory
Farmacéutica, en
practices
el
from
cual
the Public
mostraremos los
Observatory
resultados del
on the
estudio
regulation of
desarrollado por el
pharmaceutical
Instituto
products,
de
and we will show the
Perspectiva e
results of the
Innovación
studies
continuos
developed by
con
the
el apoyo de la
Institute
Federación
on
Latinoamericana
Perspective
de la
and
Industria
Health
Farmacéutica.
with the support of the
Todavía
Latin
tenemos
American
personas
Federation
que
of
van
the
a ir ingresando, así
pharmaceutical
que
industry. We have
damos
people that are
algunos
joining,
segundos para
and
que vayan entrando. Mi
we will
nombre es
have a
Brandon
few
Hernández, soy el
seconds
coordinador de
for
gestión y
them to
seguimiento de
be
vinos de
joining.
la
My name is
dependencia
Brandon Hernandez,
que
coordinator
está
of
liderando junto a
follow-up
FIFARMA este
and
lanzamiento
the
y es un
think
honor
tank
para mí
uh,
darles la más
working
cordial
together with
bienvenida.
FIFARMA on this launch, and it's an honor for me to welcome you all.
Buenos días a todos. Estimados colegas,
Good morning,
invitados
everyone, dear
especiales y
colleagues,
líderes del ecosistema de
and
innovación,
everyone from the ecosystem
e
and innovation
investigación.
in our region.
Para mí es
So
un honor en mi calidad
it's an honor
de
for me
director
as
de
a
INOS darles la bienvenida al
director
lanzamiento
of
del primer
UNOS
informe del
to welcome you
Observatorio
all
de Buenas
to the
Prácticas
launch and the
Regulatorias en la
report
región
from
de
the Best
productos
Practices
farmacéuticos.
Observatory
Este
on
evento marca
the
un hito
regulation
significativo
of
para nuestra
pharmaceutical
región al
products. This is a
consolidar un esfuerzo
significant milestone
colectivo
for our
para
region,
evaluar y promover la
consolidating an
implementación de
effort in
principios
promoting
regulatorios
the
que
implementation
aseguren
of
sistemas de
the
salud
regulations
más
to
eficientes,
ensure
transparentes y
systems of health
enfocados en
that
el
are more
bienestar de
efficient,
nuestras
transparent,
poblaciones.
and for the well-being of our populations.
Quiero aprovechar este momento para
I want to
expresar mi más
promote
sincero
this
agradecimiento a
uh,
FIFARMA y en
time
particular a su
to
presidenta
express
Janet
my
Hija
gratitude to
por su
FIFARMA and
visión,
its president,
apoyo y
Janet Yija,
compromiso con este
for
proyecto.
her commitment
Este
and
informe
support.
no habría sido
And
posible sin su respaldo constante y el
it would
trabajo
not have been
conjunto con todas
possible
las
without your
organizaciones y
support.
expertos que
So,
participaron.
with all the
Hoy
organizations and experts
celebramos
participating,
no solo los
we will be
hallazgos de
celebrating
este estudio, sino
the
también el inicio de
findings
una
of
conversación
the
más
study and the
profunda
beginning
sobre
of a deeper
cómo podemos
conversation
avanzar juntos
on
para
how
fortalecer nuestras
to
capacidades regulatorias, reducir barreras de
strengthen
acceso y
our
sobre todo
facilities.
garantizar que la innovación
So,
llegue a quienes más la necesitan.
to
Nuevamente,
also
bienvenidos y muchas
guarantee
gracias por
that
acompañarnos. Y ahora
we
cedo la palabra
can
a Janet.
take all the information to wherever it needs it. So we
Muchas
hand over now to
gracias,
Janet
Carlos
Yija.
Felipe. Y bueno, muy
Carlos Felipe,
bienvenidos todos los que nos
thank you very
acompañan
much,
en esta
and
mañana
welcome
de hoy a este
everyone
webinar.
who are joining
Increíble
us today
que
on this
siendo
webinar.
diciembre
It's incredible that
tengamos
it's already December,
esta cantidad
but
de
we
personas
have
registradas a este
this
webinar.
amount of people
Seguramente
registered
eso habla un poco de
at
la
the webinar. This
importancia
speaks
de este
to
tipo
the
de
importance
escenarios y este tipo de
of this type
estudios
of
para la
venue
región. Y
and
bueno, empezamos
studies
con
for
un
the region.
agradecimiento
I'd like to start
precisamente
with
a
a
Carlos Felipe
thank
Escobar,
you
director de INOS,
to Carlos
pero también a
Felipe
Diego Salas,
Escobar,
el
the
director de
director of Linus,
Asuntos
and Diego
Regulatorios,
Salas, director
por la labor
of
que han
FIFARMA
hecho, por el labor
Regulatory
que han
Affairs,
cumplido para
because
lograr los resultados que hoy
they
vamos a
have
ver. Así que ha
achieved
sido un ejercicio bien interesante
so many
para todos, bien
important activities and
interesante,
very
como
interesting
una
activities
apuesta
for
importante en la que nos adentramos
the
desde
important
FIFARMA
gamble
para poder poner un
that we
aporte
have from
adicional
FIFARMA
en las buenas prácticas
to
regulatorias de
give
la
an
región.
additional
Como ya dijo Carlos
contribution
Felipe, soy Janet Gija, soy la directora
for the
ejecutiva de
region.
FIFARMA,
As Carlo
que es la
Felipe, I
Federación
am Janet
Latinoamericana
Yija,
de la Industria
director of
Farmacéutica de
FIFARMA, the
Investigación y
Latin American
Desarrollo.
Federation
Y
of
nuestra
Investigation
misión,
and
como
Research
muchos
and
de los
Development.
presentes hoy, es promover el acceso a la
And our
innovación, la
mission, as for
investigación
many who
científica
are
y el
joining us
bienestar de
here,
los pacientes,
is
innovando
the
por la
scientific
salud
generation
regional.
and
Somos conscientes en
to
FIFARMA de
innovate
que la
with
solución
health.
a los retos que
So
enfrentan los sistemas regulatorios y los sistemas de salud no
these
dependen
are
de un
the
único
regulatory
actor. Y
affairs
esto es algo
that
que
are faced
insisto
and not
permanentemente.
depending
La
on a
respuesta
single player. I
está
insist on this
en la
permanently.
cooperación conjunta.
The
Y
answer
por eso
is
una de las cosas
in
que
the
siempre estamos haciendo
joint
en FIFARMA es
coordination. So
articularnos con otros actores,
here
trabajar en conjunto con otros
we have
actores. Y yo quiero agradecer
articulated
especialmente a INOS,
and
porque
working with other players. So I
en
want
los
to
años que llevo en
thank
FIFARMA le
Inos
hemos pedido, le
because
hemos
in
encomendado
the years
varias
we've been at
tareas
FIFARMA,
y han
we've
apostado por sus
recommended
tareas
several
precisamente,
tasks and
digamos, en
they've
apoyo
gambled
a
and
otras
bet on them
organizaciones
and
para
worked
poder
on them very
avanzar
hard. And
en lo que
so
nos
thank you for all
compete
this
como
support
región. Yo quiero
in everything
un
that
par de mensajes. No me
gathers
voy
us
a
as a
detener
region.
a hablar de los resultados
I'd
del
like to
estudio,
give you a
porque
couple
esos
of
vendrán
messages. I'm not going to talk about the
posteriormente.
results of
Creo
the
que son
study. That's
resultados
what
bien
will come later.
interesantes que aportarán un montón.
Very
Pero tal vez
interesting
quiero hacer
results.
dos
And
comentarios
I want to make two
como de
comments
introducción a esa presentación de los
as an
resultados. Lo
introduction
primero es que
to
promover
the
buenas prácticas
presentation of the studies.
regulatorias y
First, we
promover
need to
buenos
promote
procesos regulatorios
best
es uno de
regulatory
los objetivos de
practices and
FIFARMA
regulatory
y de
processes.
muchas
It's
organizaciones con
one
las que
of the
trabajamos
goals at
permanentemente.
FIFARMA,
Y al
and we
final
have
nuestra
many
aspiración es
organizations
ver
that we
que las
work with.
agencias
And
sanitarias de
at
nuestra
the end,
región
our aspiration
avancen
is that the
hacia altos
agencies in our
estándares de
region
calidad y de
advance
gestión. Y
towards
lo que
high
queremos hacer
quality
justamente con este
standards.
reporte es que sea un
And what we
insumo
want
para ese
with this
objetivo que
report is
acabo
that it
de
is an
mencionar. Ese es
input
el primer mensaje
for
que quería
this
dejarles a todos ustedes.
motive,
Y
for
un
this
segundo
reason
mensaje
that
es
I
que
just
la
mentioned.
colaboración es
So a
clave.
second message is
Insisto,
that
yo insisto mucho en ese
collaboration is
mensaje.
key. I
Colaboración como la que
insist
tenemos
very
con
much on
Pharma,
this.
Inos, colaboración
We
como la que
need
tenemos con muchos otros lados,
collaboration
pero también
and
la
with other players,
colaboración entre
and also
agencias es
cooperation
clave. Y
between
lo que vemos en
agencies,
este estudio
and
es
that's
que
key.
encontramos
What we
agencias que
see in
están
this
muy
study
avanzadas
is
en
that we
unos
find
temas
agencies
y
that are
tal vez
very
no
advanced in
tan
some
avanzadas en
topics,
otros. Y
and
precisamente en esa
here,
posibilidad de compartir
with this
buenas prácticas
possibility to
hay
share
también
best
una
practices,
oportunidad
there's
grande para la región.
also
Y este
a
estudio lo
great
ofrece.
opportunity
Y
for
yo
the
creo que es
region.
algo bien
So
especial
this is
que
something
queremos
very
resaltar
special
de este
that
estudio.
we want to highlight in
A
this
mí en
study.
particular, pero yo sé que a
And
todo el equipo
particularly
de Inos y de
speaking,
Pharma nos llena de
with
mucha
the Enos and
satisfacción
P Pharma
estar hoy
team,
ya
we're very
presentando
happy
este
to be
estudio, estos
presenting
datos, que
these
además es una
studies and
metodología
data
distinta, una metodología
that
que lo que intentó fue nutrirse de la
a
opinión
methodology
de
that attempts to
profesionales
nurture
que
from
trabajan a
the
diario en gestiones
professionals that are
ante las
working
agencias
daily
regulatorias. Y
on
más que esos profesionales,
missions with
son
the
los que más
regulations,
saben de
and
lo que
who and
pasa y de lo que no
better than
pasa y de
those
dónde hay
professionals
oportunidades, de
that
dónde hay
know
un
what's
desafío, de
happening and
dónde
what's not,
realmente hay avances
and there's the
importantes.
challenges that
Entonces,
we
por eso
have
creo que es un
where there is
estudio
important
distinto,
process
pero es un estudio
progress.
realmente
So it's a
valioso
different
para
study.
aportar en
It's
esta tarea.
innovative,
Pharma e Inos, como ya
and
lo he mencionado,
with
compartimos
P
ese proyecto
Pharma and
común
Enos,
de
as I
apoyo a un
mentioned,
trabajo
it's a
coordinado,
great moment
un
to
trabajo
do this
compartido y un
coordinated
elemento
effort
facilitador del progreso
with
económico,
a
social y
facilitation
en salud para la
element
región.
for
Y por
health for the
esa
region.
parte lo que
And
queremos es
that's
que
why part of what
no
we want
solamente hoy
is
lancemos
that
este
not
estudio,
just
sino que
this
durante el
study,
próximo
but
año podamos
throughout the
estar
next year, we
teniendo
can be
escenarios
having
de
scenarios
compartir,
of
escenarios de
sharing
conversación basados en los
experiences,
insumos que hoy vamos
conversation
a ver.
based on the
Yo lo que
inputs
los invito
that we
es
have
ya a
now.
que
So
a
what
partir de
we
ahora se
invite you
concentren
now
en
is
escuchar
to
los hallazgos
focus
de este
on
reporte.
the findings of
Y
this
ya
report.
como lo mencionarán más
And
adelante, es un
as
reporte
we will
enfocado
mention
en las
later,
recomendaciones de
this
la
is focused
OMS
on
en
the
un enfoque de
recommendations of the
transparencia,
WHO
consistencia y eficiencia
with
en los
transparency,
procesos regulatorios,
consistency, and
que al final lo que
efficiency.
queremos es que
And
eso,
at
y
the
lo
end of
que
the
ya
day,
he
what we
mencionado de esta
want is
introducción,
that
sirva
during
de
this
insumo,
introduction, I've
sirva
said it,
de
it's
elemento,
an
sirva
input
de
as
un aporte
elements
adicional para las
for
organizaciones.
a
Yo lo
separate
que siempre
contribution
voy a
for these.
terminar con lo que siempre
So
digo, lo
I'm
difícil es
always
que hoy en día
ending
no
with
son
what I'm saying
complejos,
now,
las
which is
oportunidades también
we're
lo son y la
facing complex
colaboración es
opportunities,
la clave.
and
Muchas gracias a
collaboration
todos
is
y ojalá
key.
disfruten este
So
lanzamiento y ojalá sea
hopefully you
un
can enjoy this
reporte
launch,
que
and
ayude
this
a
is a report
mejorar
that
y avanzar
helps
en esa
to
conversación
improve
en la región.
and
Mil
help with
gracias y
this conversation.
bienvenidos.
So thank you and welcome.
Muchísimas gracias, Janet,
Thank you very
directora
much,
ejecutiva de
Janet, for
Pharma,
this
Carlos Felipe Escobar, director de INOS,
introduction.
quien
Carlos
nos van a
Felipe,
estar
as the director
acompañando
of
durante
Enos,
este
will be
espacio.
joining us
Antes de
throughout this
avanzar
space.
en la agenda, quisiera
And with the
compartirles
agenda,
o
we'd like to
recordar más
share
bien
and remind you
de pronto
that
las instrucciones
the
de las traducciones
instructions of the
que tenemos de
translation
manera
or the
simultánea.
interpretation that we have
Si
simultaneously,
podemos volver
uh,
al
if we can
slide
go back
donde
to
están
the
las
slide
instrucciones y
where we
pues
have the instructions,
dependiendo de su
please.
idioma de preferencia,
So depending
pueden
on your
escoger
language of
mantener el idioma
preference, you
original
could
o
choose
bien
to
hasta
keep your
realizar todo
original
en
language,
español, pero
or
pueden
you
escuchar
can
las
also
traducciones
hear the
simultáneas en
interpretation
inglés y
into
en
English
portugués
and
a través
Portuguese.
del icono del
So
mundo que
through
aparece
the
abajo, ahí pueden
icon that you
seleccionar
can
el
see
idioma de
in this
preferencia.
section, you can see
Adicionalmente, contarles un poco
this
cómo va a ser la agenda del día de
language
hoy.
of your
Estas palabras
preference.
de
And now we're
bienvenida
going to
dan
look at
el
the agenda. So
inicio
we're going to
o la
welcome
introducción
for
al
the
webinar.
introduction
Posteriormente
of the webinar.
tendremos de
So we're
manera
going to have
inmediata la participación de Diego
immediately
Salas, que es
the
director de
participation
Asuntos
of Diego
Regulatorios de
Salas,
PIFARMA, y va a
the
estar conversando un poco sobre el valor de
about
las
pharma
buenas
topics,
prácticas en la
who's going
regulación
to be talking
sanitaria,
about the
como esa
best
gran antesala para la
regulation
presentación
and
oficial del
practices
estudio del
on
Observatorio de Buenas
sanitation
Prácticas
and health, and the
Regulatorias en la
Observatory
regulación de
for
productos
best
farmacéuticos.
regulatory
Y al
practices
final
for
tendremos
the regulation
una
of
parte de
pharmaceutical products.
preguntas y
And at the
respuestas,
end,
que ahí
we
dejo
have some
en la
questions and
plataforma
answers
la mejor
for
manera para
the
enviar sus
platform
preguntas.
and the
Así
best
que
possible way to send
la
your questions.
recomendación es
So
tomar mucha
the
nota
recommendation is to take
y
notes
también ir
and
guardando
also
esas preguntas
to
o inquietudes que
save
puedan ir surgiendo
your
durante todo
questions
el
that
espacio.
you have
De esta
throughout
manera,
the
quisiera
event.
cederle la palabra a Diego para continuar con la
I'd like to hand over
presentación
now to
del
Diego to
webinar.
continue with the
Adelante.
introduction of the webinar.
Muchas gracias y muy buenos
Thank you
días
very much
para
and good
todos.
morning,
Es
everyone.
importante
It's very
entrar en
important to
contexto para
come into
poder
context and
analizar
understand
los
and
resultados de
analyze the
mejor manera.
results of
Y aquí
in the
vamos
best
a hablar
possible
un
way.
poco de los
And
llamados
we're going to be talking
causas de la
about the calling of the World Health Organization around the strengthening of the regulatory authorities. The regulatory national authorities have to guarantee that the sanitary regulation is a vehicle that allows to reach the goals of public health. Therefore, the authorities have to use a regulatory framework that can reach the level of supervision at the same time as facilitating
La
access.
Organización Mundial de la Salud
The
estima
World
que más
Health
de 2.000
Organization
millones de
estimates that
personas en
over
el
2
mundo
billion people in
no
the
tienen
world
acceso a los
do not
medicamentos
have
esenciales.
access to
Las
their
razones
essential
para un acceso
medications. And
limitado o
the reasons
insuficiente
for
son
limited
numerosas,
access are
pero entre
very
estas
doubtful
causas
and
destacan la
insufficient, but
capacidad
in
regulatoria
among these
inadecuada,
cases, we have the
la
inadequate
falta de
regulatory capacity, the
colaboración
lack
y el
of
reparto en el
collaboration,
ámbito de la
and
regulación de
the
medicamentos
distribution of
entre los países.
medications that is uneven
La
between the countries.
globalización en el desarrollo, la producción
Globalization
y el
and development,
suministro de
production,
productos
and the supply
farmacéuticos
of
a nivel
pharmaceutical
global,
products at global
el
level,
ritmo acelerado de
and
los cambios
the
tecnológicos y
accelerated
sociales
pace of
y las
technological
limitaciones
changes,
de
and
recursos
the
humanos y
constraints of human
financieros de los sistemas
resources
regulatorios
and the
ha
regulatory
vuelto a la
systems
regulación de los
has
productos farmacéuticos
turned
cada
this
vez más compleja.
into a more
Por ello,
complex
la
issue.
67ª
Therefore,
Asamblea Mundial de
the
la Salud reconoció la
67th
importancia de contar con sistemas
edition
regulatorios
of
sólidos al
the
aprobar la resolución
reunion of the
6720,
World
en
Health
donde se
Organization
señala que
accepts
los
Resolution
sistemas
6720,
de
where
regulación
it points out that
eficaces
the
son un
efficient and
componente
efficacious
esencial del
regulation systems
fortalecimiento
are an
del sistema
essential
de salud
component for
público
the
de un país
strengthening of the
y
public
que
health system
contribuyen a la
in
obtención de
countries
mejores resultados.
and that
Que
contributes
el
to better
personal de los
results.
sistemas regulatorios es
That
una
the staff
parte
from
esencial
regulatory
del
systems
personal
is an essential
sanitario
part
y que
of
los
this
sistemas de
scenario, and
regulación ineficaces
the
pueden constituir en
inefficient
sí
systems
mismo
can
un
in
obstáculo al
themselves
acceso a los
represent an
productos
obstacle
farmacéuticos.
to access these
Los
pharmaceutical products.
informes de la
The
Organización
reports
Panamericana
from
de
the
la Salud
Pan American
evidencian
Health
las
Organization
brechas en la
show
capacidad
the
regulatoria
gaps
de la
in
sanidad,
regulatory
en donde
capacity,
solamente el
where
23% de
only
las autoridades reguladoras de
23%
la
of the
región,
regulatory
es
authorities of
decir,
the
8
region,
países,
that is only 8
poseen las
countries,
bases legales y los
possess
marcos
the legal
organizacionales más
framework
completos para
that are
cumplir
more
con sus funciones.
comprehensive
En
to fulfill the
contraposición,
goals.
20% de las autoridades de las
In
Américas
comparison,
no
20%
cuentan con las bases
of the
legales
Americas
y los
countries do
marcos
not have
organizacionales
the
necesarios
vital
para
needs
cumplir
in
con
the
su
regulatory
mandato
frameworks
de manera
to
eficiente.
fulfill these
La
goals
política para
efficiently.
el fortalecimiento de
The
los sistemas
policy for the
regulatorios
strengthening of
nacionales de
regulatory
medicamentos y
systems
otras
in
tecnologías
medications and
sanitarias,
other sanitary
aprobada por los
technologies
Estados
that are
miembros en
approved by the
septiembre de
member states
2022,
in September
insta a los
2022
países a adoptar
invites the
marcos
countries
para la
to
concepción
adopt
de sistemas
frameworks for the construction
regulatorios
of regulatory
coherentes
systems
con los
that are
sistemas de salud
coherent
y
with the
con las
health
necesidades del
systems
sector
and with
industrial.
the needs of
Esta
the
resolución
industries.
también insta a los países
And
a
this also
fortalecer
encourages
la autoridad
countries
reguladora
to
y
strengthen
a
the regulatory
coordinar los
authority and
integrantes de los sistemas
coordinate the
regulatorios
members
mediante
of these
mecanismos
regulatory systems by
transparentes,
way of transparent
formales y
mechanisms that are
eficientes
formal and
basados
efficient,
en buenas prácticas
based on
regulatorias.
best
Y esta
regulatory
política
practices.
también reconoce
And
que un
this
marco
policy
regulatorio
also
sólido,
acknowledges
la
a
adopción de
solid framework
normas y
for the
criterios
adoption
internacionales, la contratación y la
of
capacitación
the
constante del
hiring
personal son
of
condiciones
staff,
necesarias
which
pero
are
insuficientes
necessary conditions
para
but not
garantizar una
enough
buena
to
supervisión
guarantee
regulatoria.
good
Estas
regulatory
medidas deben
supervision. These
combinarse con
measures
las
have to
buenas
be
prácticas
combined with the
regulatorias
best
que guíen a
regulatory
todas las personas
practices,
en las
guiding
agencias
all
a
the people in the
formular las
agencies
mejores decisiones.
to formulate the best
Pero, ¿qué son
decisions.
entonces las buenas
But
prácticas
what are
regulatorias?
these best
Son,
practices?
por definición de la OMS, un conjunto de
So, the
principios y
decision of
prácticas
WHO
que se aplican
is
al
for the best
desarrollo, a la
practices to apply
implementación
the
y a la
development of the
revisión de los
implementation and
instrumentos
review
regulatorios, las leyes, las
and
resoluciones,
regulatory
los
framework.
decretos, las
And so,
directrices, para lograr los objetivos de salud pública de una
here
manera
for
más eficiente.
the
La
directions,
aplicación de las buenas
it
prácticas
is a more
regulatorias es el
efficient
sello
use of the best
distintivo de un
practices.
sistema
And this is the
regulatorio
seal
moderno,
of a modern
receptivo
regulatory
y
system.
basado en la ciencia,
And
en
it
el
is
cual las
based on
regulaciones dan
science.
lugar a los resultados
So
previstos.
these
Las
are
buenas
the
prácticas
regulatory
regulatorias no son
and
el
the
consejo
foreseen results. And the
técnico
best
que
practices are
realiza el
not the
regulador,
technical counsel of
sino
the
cómo el
regulator,
regulador
but instead
realiza su
how the
trabajo.
regulator does their
Las
work.
buenas prácticas regulatorias se
The
basan en
best
9
regulatory
principios
practices are
que
based
han sido
on
además
9 principles
ampliamente
that have been
incorporados como
broadly
indicadores y
incorporated into
subindicadores de
indicators
la
and
herramienta mundial
sub-indicators
para la evaluación de los
and
sistemas regulatorios nacionales de productos
for the
médicos,
national regulatory
GBT por
systems,
sus siglas en inglés.
where
Y estos
which is
principios son la
GBT in
realidad
its English
en la cual el
acronym,
diseño de
and
sistemas regulatorios y las decisiones que se toman
where the regulatory
deben
systems and
siempre
decisions that are
contar con un
made
fundamento
are
jurídico.
always in
La
or
coherencia
should always
es
have
que
a
la regulación
regulatory
sanitaria
base.
debe siempre aplicarse de manera previsible y homogénea y ser
So these should
coherente con
be
la
applied
regulación ordenamental
homogeneously
existente.
and in a foreseeable manner
Las
with the regulatory systems
instituciones
of each
que tienen a
country.
su cargo
The
la regulación de los
institutions that
productos
are
farmacéuticos
tasked with
deben
the production
contar
of
con
pharmaceutical
independencia
products
técnica
have to
y estar
have
exentas de
technical
influencias
independence and be
políticas.
exempt from
En cuanto a
undue
imparcialidad, todos
influences.
los regulados deben
In
recibir un
terms of
estudio
impartiality,
comparativo justo e
They should
imparcial.
receive equitable
Cuando hablamos de
treatment that
proporcionalidad,
is
ahora
fair
nos
and
referimos a que las
impartial.
regulaciones y las
WHO says
decisiones
that the
deben ser
regulations and the
proporcionales al
decisions
riesgo y a
have to
la
be
capacidad del
proportional in
regulador para
risk
aplicar
and in the capacity
efectivamente
of the
dicho
regulator
recurso.
to
La
effectively apply
flexibilidad
the
no es
regulation.
más que no
Flexibility
contar con
is
regulaciones
no more
restrictivas,
than not
sino con
having
regulatorios
these
flexibles que
regulations
puedan responder a un
and
entorno
having
cambiante y a
flexible
situaciones imprevistas.
means
La claridad nos dice que
to
las
have
regulaciones deben
these
ser claras
results.
y comprendidas por
And
todos los
it says
regulados.
that they should be
La eficiencia
understood
nos
by all
dice
the
que los
regulated
reguladores
parties
deben cumplir con sus
and
objetivos
they should
en un
fulfill their
plazo
goals
y a un costo razonable. Y la
and at a
transparencia nos dice
cost
que
that
los
is
requisitos
reasonable.
regulatorios y
And
las decisiones deben darse a conocer y
here,
se
the
deben
decisions
solicitar
have to be
aportes
made
por medio
and
de las consultas públicas.
requesting
Por otra
contributions with the
parte, un
public
entorno
policies.
propicio
On the
facilita
other
la
hand,
aplicación
the
eficaz de las
right
buenas prácticas regulatorias.
landscape
Y este entorno
propitiates the
propicio se ve
application of best
facilitado por
practices.
el
And
apoyo
this
sostenido de los
is
niveles
aided
políticos y
by sustained
gubernamentales,
development and
primordial para la aplicación
support
correcta del
from the
concepto de los
governments and
principios.
institutions for the
La
proper operation of
estructura
the
y la línea
principles,
de
the
autoridad de
structure,
todas
and
las
the line of
instituciones del sistema
opportunity for every
regulatorio debe
institution
ser
in the
muy
regulatory
definida.
system have to be
Una
well defined.
comunicación
And
adecuada y
communication,
eficaz
adequate
juega
and
un
efficacious
papel
communication
fundamental en el
plays an
intercambio de
important role
información
in
dentro y
the
fuera de
exchange
las
of information
instituciones.
in and out of the
Un sistema
institutions.
de gestión de la
A
calidad que
system
incluye
of
la
quality
aplicación de los
management that
principios de
includes the
gestión del
application
riesgo
of
hace que las decisiones
risk
sean más
management
creíbles
principles, making
y
decisions
sus
more
operaciones
believable
estables.
and more
En
credible
cuanto a
and more
recursos humanos
stable.
financieros, para
As far
cumplir
as
tanto con el
financial and
regulatorio
human
como con el
resources, they
eficaz,
should
los recursos
fulfill
financieros
the
son
regulatory mandate.
fundamentales para la
Financial resources are
independencia, la
fundamental for the
imparcialidad, la
independence and
coherencia y la eficiencia.
impartiality,
Una serie de conocimientos
credibility, and
científicos y
efficiency.
técnicos del personal contribuye al
Scientific
desarrollo y la implementación de un
knowledge
sistema
to promote the
regulatorio y
development of
eficaz.
a regulatory
Y
system that
el
is
personal
efficient.
regulatorio debe
And the
cumplir con
regulatory
principios
staff
y valores
should
éticos.
have the right
Y
ethical
las
principles and
decisiones
values.
regulatorias deben
Regulatory
siempre
decisions
basarse en
always have
fundamentos
to be based
científicos
on
y en datos precisos,
fundamentals of
no en
science
la
and precise
intuición o en la
data,
arbitrariedad.
not
Cada
on
vez se reconoce más
any
la función primordial que
arbitrary
desempeñan los sistemas
decisions.
regulatorios
So
nacionales en la salud
we
pública
understand these
y en el
regulatory systems
desarrollo
in public
público.
health and in the development
Conscientes del valor que
of our
añade la
activity.
adopción de las
We are
buenas
aware
prácticas
of the value
regulatorias a la
added by
regulación
the
de
regulatory
productos
practices
farmacéuticos.
in the production of pharmaceutical
Conscientes de la
products.
necesidad de
Aware
pasar de
of
la
the
teoría
need
a la
to
práctica.
move from theory to practice.
Conscientes de la necesidad de
Aware
contar con
of the
datos
need
apoyados
of
por la opinión
having
de todos
contact
ustedes,
and
los
supported by the
usuarios de
opinion
los
of
servicios
everyone, the
regulatorios.
users of
Y
regulatory
conscientes
services,
de que la
and
construcción de un
aware
sistema
that the
regulatorio
construction of a
moderno y
regulatory
basado en
system
ciencia
that is
es tarea
modern
de
and based
todos,
on science is
fue como nos
everyone's
inspiramos
task.
para la creación de
That's
este
how we are
observatorio.
inspired for the creation
Quiero
of this
invitar a
observatory.
que los datos que
So
está el doctor Carlos Felipe a punto de mostrar
Carlos Felipe
puedan
is
ser
going to show
utilizados
this,
como una
and
herramienta que apoye la
they could be
formulación de
used
políticas que
as a
soporten
tool
el
for policies that
fortalecimiento
support the
continuo y
strengthening,
progresivo de los
continuous and
sistemas
progressive
regulatorios
strengthening of
como
regulatory
un pilar
systems.
esencial de
And
los sistemas
this is
de
an
salud
essential
pública.
pillar of public
Muchas
health.
gracias.
Thank you very
Carlos,
much.
adelante, por
Carlos,
favor.
Mil gracias, Diego, por
thank you
tu
very much. So
introducción. Y a Janet, nuevamente también gracias por
here,
esa
thank you very much
introducción
for this
en la que yo
introduction,
creo que
where
quisiera
I
iniciar
think
resaltando
that I
ese
would like to start
reconocimiento
highlighting the
que le
acknowledgments
hicimos
that
al
we
trabajo
made
de la
for
Organización
the
Mundial de la
work
Salud
of the
al
World Health
generar
Organization in generating
anexo 11.
the
Lo primero,
Annex 11.
por su
First,
objetivo trascendente,
because if
el
of its
objetivo de impactar al final la
transcendent
salud
goal to
pública de
impact
las
public health
naciones y
of the
entender y
nations,
poner a la salud pública
to
en primera
understand and
línea
place public
como
health
la gran
in the first
beneficiaria de
line as
que
the
las
major
autoridades
beneficiary,
regulatorias cuenten con
that the regulatory
mecanismos
entities can have
dinámicos
the
que
mechanisms
permitan
they need
diseñar,
and that are
actualizar
dynamic
y
to allow
mantener y
them to
responder a
update
todos los
and
retos que
maintain and
están
respond
suponiendo
to
todos
all
los
the
cambios,
risks
la
that
innovación
they're facing because of the
sanitaria
changes
en el mundo
from
entero y obviamente los
sanitary
desafíos
innovation
que
in the
presentan los
world,
sistemas de
and
salud
especially the
nuestras
challenges
naciones. Lo
posed
primero,
by the
el
health
gran
systems in our
aprendizaje que
nation.
se tuvo. Lo segundo,
So
resaltar
that's the
la
first main
legitimidad
goal.
del proceso con el cual
Second,
la OMS
highlighting the
construyó
legitimacy
anexo 11
of the World Health
y generó estas
Organization's Annex
recomendaciones,
11,
un
which
proceso
generated these
ampliamente
recommendations as
colaborativo con
a
la
project
participación de
that
las
was
mismas
collaborative in
autoridades
itself
regulatorias,
and with the participation
expertos
of
e
the
industria,
regulatory
de manera
authorities
que,
and
como
experts
deben ser
from
las
the
cosas,
industry. So
colaborando. Lo
the way things
tercero,
should be done
la
in
forma en que están
collaboration.
formuladas
And third,
estas
the way in
recomendaciones.
which
El anexo
these
11 es una
recommendations are
forma
formulated,
propositiva,
which
lo que nos
is
propone desde
a
esos principios
way
y esos
that
facilitadores
proposes, and the facilitators that Diego just explained, this is not just a framework to qualify or unqualify the regulatory authorities, but it's more of a framework to propose and to show how we want to manage things for the best results. And the last thing is to highlight then, since we since this came out to be, we had not stopped to assess and to understand how the adoption of these best practices is going in the region for pharmaceutical products. And so this is where we intended to do that. The annex and all of these deserve the support of all the players, and we wanted to give that support and that contribution in the perspective of assessing what is going on. In this assessment, we are communicating uh, the principles and the facilitators for best practices. But at the same time, we wanted to have a baseline that would allow us to understand in the future how we are progressing in that option. So it's about assessing the best regulatory practices that were recommended by WHO and the authorities that were regulated in the nation for medications, and consulting the opinion of experts and groups from all kinds of stakeholder groups that are involved, all the way from the pharmaceutical industry, consultants, and members of the regulatory authorities of the different countries. That is, it is the voices of experts from the region that are interacting and technically participating in the processes. So these are the 8 countries: Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil. 9 principles that WHO proposes, 8 facilitators, and fundamentally, from the methodological standpoint, what we did was to assess the adoption. We designed a methodology whereby we expressed through different rubrics the different principles and facilitators and their key elements that are proposed, as the WHO says, for the experts to make an assessment of what level of adoption they understand and what their opinion is on each facilitator and each development in their country. Having said that, this was a fundamental element. We did not add any element to the principles or facilitators, nor did we remove anything. It was fundamental to work to the letter on the implementations of WHO. There's a fundamental element. Apart from asking the experts to do this assessment, we asked them to share and comment on their opinions, their different experiences. So the first thing we did was to design this model and to validate this. And so for the assessment, they provided their comments and made their developments or their comments for improvement. And that's one of the most important elements, because this is a very significant number and throughout the region. So finally, to analyze all of this information and to generate the reports that we have. So these are the results of this first assessment, and this is the adoption of the best regulatory practices. We had a participation of 240 experts from the 8 countries, selected countries. The analysis had the participation fundamentally of significant participation of Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Peru, who we want to highlight in their participation. And however, we did not have very high participation from countries like Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil. Therefore, from the methodological and statistical standpoint, these countries were not included in the tabulation of the data. The stakeholder groups that were considered, as you can see, were laboratories, pharmaceutical labs, consultants, members of regulatory authorities, and other experts with a broad experience level, 16 or more years of experience, most of them, 48%, and in the different areas of the regulatory authorities, pharmacosurveillance, and distribution. So I'm going to present the results of the 9 principles that we explained earlier from Annex 11, as you can see on this slide, in order, in descending order. We have the principles that in the region have the highest adoption on average. They were impartiality, transparency, proportionality, efficiency, etc. And on each one to the right, you can see the countries that in the region were, this is the average. The regional average is the number in the center. And to the right are the countries that had the best performance, so to speak, the most developed performance. Peru, 69% for impartiality. Mexico for transparency. And in the bottom part, we have the principles that we have to focus on the most to strengthen in the region. So the ones that have the lower levels of adoption, and I highlight the flexibility, clarity, and independence of these general recommendations. To the right, I will summarize what the sentiment was on the recommendations of the different contributions made by the expert that participated in the assessment. And here I will move on to explain one by one the 9 principles of impartiality with the most adoption, where the strength was in independence, institutional independence, and the key elements of this principle with a higher delay or larger lag, so to speak, was resilience. And the recommendation here is to understand the criteria and the evidence of the decisions made on the regulations, fostering transparency in regulatory processes and reports, and transparency as well. This is another element for adoption, above 60%, 61% on average in the region, and where we see consultation from the stakeholder groups as the key element of this principle with the most adoption. However, the culture of aperture is a topic that we need to work on as experts. And here we have, or we find the recommendations. You'll see in several points the strengthening of the investment on information and technology systems. They insist a lot on this tool as a key to give transparency and for the whole process, and fostering regulatory work that you're going to see from the experts and many of the consultants that we have, with the importance of this collaboration with formal mechanisms with the interested parties. And this was a very important element for the regulatory processes that we have in the assessment. And this is an example that we can see and will not fall just on the regulatory authorities, but also on the support of the different stakeholder groups and for the more clear communication of these aspects that we will have in all these areas. The proportionality in the region highlights the key aspects of evaluation and risks and benefits, and perhaps a little more lagging behind is the national capacity for compliance.
It is in proportion. It means that regulation is as such as we could really do and develop. So now the recommendations are strengthening decision making based on risks, improving the capacity for compliance. And now, in regards to efficacy, we are in the mid part of our table of principles adoption. We see the evaluation of efforts and resources as a key element best evaluated in the efficiency principle, and really the evaluation of efficiency as with a greater lag. Here we have the recommendation of the adoption of the regulatory reliance mechanism for the different functions as a mechanism that would clearly allow us to be more efficient in the region, and the optimization and allocation of resources and promoting digitalization and use of artificial intelligence to make all these processes more efficient. Legality is 55%, the authority in 62.9%, and international cooperation is the key aspect with greatest lag right now. Now, the regional and international regulatory framework and the strengthening of the legal and regulatory frameworks with international standards, and in developing continuous training programs for regulatory personnel. And in regards to coherence, we see that the key element was the legal and political coherence, and that we insist in the importance of complementing the regulations. This was the key aspect with the greatest lag, and here we also invite to the interinstitutional coordination as a key element for the development of this principle, and the regulatory convergence in adoption in line with international standards. Now, let's go to the principles that have the greatest lag. Lowest adoption in the region, and among which we have independence, where the extension of undue influences is what is best evaluated, but the adequate funding is the Achilles heel in the region, having an evaluation below 50%. And that's why, for obvious reasons, the strengthening of funding for the operation and regulatory improvement are key in guaranteeing capacities, knowledge, and skills and competencies in officials and in the authorities, and the evaluation and accountability publicly. So it's key, as we have seen, that it's necessary to strengthen this in general in all the region. And the clarity was the next aspect with a lower evaluation in regards to its adoption, highlighting the adoption process of clear regulations. However, a regulation aligned with standards that are international, and that became the Achilles heel again. Once again, the recommendation right now is strengthening this alignment with international standards, improving clarity in the drafting of the instruments, of the regulatory instruments, guidelines, fundamentals, and promoting key procedures for the entry into force of new regulations. Flexibility, the principle with the lowest evaluation, where flexibility to implement the regulation was key within this principle with the best development. But flexible regulation definitely was key, the key element with the lowest development in its adoption in the region. Once again, the recommendation is implementing more adaptable regulatory framework, establishing consultation mechanisms and collaboration between regulating agencies and the industry, and adopting practices done by the authorities that have shown to be efficient. And this summarizes the landscape of the adoption of the 9 principles proposed by the WHO. And now we go to the facilitators. The facilitators, we had with a greater adoption, a greater evaluation, the adoption in the countries of our region of ethics and interinstitutional values. And since it's a very important element, organization, governance, and leadership and evidence-based decision-making. However, we had a more lagging adoption in 3 aspects: relevant human resources, political support, and financial resources that are sufficient and sustainable. That once again, this becomes an element that is highlighted by the different experts as a key element to be able to keep operating and developing and improving in all the regulatory authorities in the region. Now, let's go take a look at each one of these facilitators based on ethics and institutional values. As you can see, the facilitator with best adoption, let's remind ourselves that facilitators are the elements that need to be in the context of the country, in the context of the regulatory authority around what it does and it should do. So the first one is ethics and institutional values. I recommend that this continuous training in ethics and values and the strengthening of conduct codes. And now, based on organization and governance and leadership of the system, the recommendation is based on strengthening organizational structures and defines roles clearly and implementing development programs and leadership and establishing coordination mechanisms among the entities. And the evidence-based decision-making is a fundamental element and that needs to keep consolidating in the entire region. And the recommendation, of course, once again, is the implementation of robust collection systems and analysis systems for data. And as you can see, this element came up in many of the recommendations of the experts. And this is an enabling element with great perspective of supporting development and strengthening of the authorities, training staff in research and analysis methodologies, incorporating scientific evidence in all the stages of the regulatory process, and encouraging an organizational structure based on empirical data, and once again, promoting international collaboration and best practices. Now we go to the solid system in quality management. We had a regional average of 58%, and we recommend establishing and strengthening this risk management framework and promotion of a quality culture, implementation of comprehensive training in quality for all officials and everybody related, in establishing exchange programs between regulatory agencies in this aspect, which is a very actionable element. And once again, we see the invitation to encourage regional collaboration and integrating advanced technologies as an element that will allow to manage quality in a much more efficient manner. Now we go to interinstitutional synergy and intra-institutional synergy. The implementation of digital platforms that are integrated for the exchange of information, digital governments, and surely this would have very important impact on coherence and in the integration of several actors in the model that we have, and setting agreements of confidentiality between agencies for information exchange, developing standardized communication protocols, creating work groups, encouraging participation in international fora of regulatory harmonization. And once again, along what I'm telling you, I want to highlight this. You can see that many of the recommendations that we were able to gather from the experts that we tried to synthesize in the report gather elements that are actionable by many stakeholders from academia, the industry, the consultancy teams that support the industry in the processes before the regulatory entities and the regulatory entity itself. But it's not just about recommendations that are headed by the authority. Here, I'd say that there's an entire portfolio of opportunities to take on actions for this development. Competent human resources developing continuous training programs translated into measurable benefits for the regulatory system, implementing strategies to attract and retain human talent, improve compensation and benefit schemes. And maybe here we did comments that were repeated on the concern about the retention of human talent, these technical know-hows that are highly technical and that are very important not only to maintain this update, but also be able to retain the talent that works in this. And finally, go to the elements or the facilitators that have the lowest adoption in the region, like political support and support of the entire government, 49%, in which we insist on the need to establish interinstitutional coordination mechanisms. And here the reading is that the authority cannot be on its own. It has to be surrounded by an ecosystem of another institutionality, the ministries and funding ministries, and that they will allow the authority to really work well. So the coordination is very important because it's political support around the regulatory authority, and it's not relatively isolated. That is, it would be difficult for it to do all the changes and develop communication strategies to create awareness on leaders on the importance of good regulatory practices and the importance of the regulatory authority. This is an element where we have to assess the importance of the regulatory entities, and we have to strengthen the legal and regulatory framework, integrating good practices in national policies and implementing continuous training programs. And we get to the weakest element in its adoption. It's sufficient and sustainable financial resources, 45.4%. It's a fundamental element. And here we propose developing legal frameworks for stable budgets, implementing mixed funding models that will also allow the authorities to receive other types of funding, establishing financial planning in the long term, and encouraging regional collaboration to optimize costs. And this would be, of course, another strategy that is doable in moments that we're living through right now. And if you can see, this aspect is fundamental for the transparency and the independence and efficiency of regulatory authorities. So I think that this mostly reflects the concern of the entire sector because our authorities have stronger financial resources to be able to work. And we now get to the conclusions. And I want to start with a few conclusions that are large, like general. And the first thing is that there is a path that we have gone down through already, but also a path to go down through. The region has diverse progress in the adoption of principles and facilitators of good practices, but we have to keep working. This is a baseline. What we have done, we cannot say if it's good, if it's bad, if it's so. This is the first time that we do the evaluation, but this allows us to say that we can't see any significant lags in any cases, but we don't see either a case with superlative progress, meaning this authority in which we can say, okay, everybody's adopted in the perception of all actors is superlative based on the adoption of good practices. What is really clear is that the principles and facilitators of the WHO are an enabling framework for the exercises that we all have to do to strengthen these good regulation practices in medications, but this means to have a collaborative work between the authorities and groups of interest that are key so that we can really have consistent progress. This will probably mean or involve that we keep assessing the attention that we're giving to the adoption of these good practices. And of course, that it finds in two key elements: the adoption of technology as a great dynamizer in the short term, because we can think that this adoption and the benefits of the adequate adoption of technology to support regulatory processes is a project that is very long. Nowadays, these developments are done in relatively short times. Now, as the other actions required to strengthen our regulatory authorities, they require an adequate funding. This is a critical aspect in the region, and this is an aspect where we have to support the regulatory authorities so that they can have these resources not only to operate and do this task, but also to do all the changes and improvements that we all need, given the challenges that exist in the world. Now, as general recommendations, is ratifying and strengthening the commitment of all parties concerned, government and the regulatory authorities and industries and advisors and the academic and other aspects in the adoption of good practices proposed by the WHO, as well as the principals and facilitators. I think we have to keep socializing this and disseminating it and looking at the good practices and explaining it. And of course, keep finding in them a description that is aspirational, and that is that allows us to carry out these actions. And this demands collaborative initiatives, focus on less adopted phenomena, and thus we can share advances and experiences. And maybe a few recommendations on resources and capacities extracted from the different elements that you saw along the presentation is diversify mechanisms from the authorities, investment in technological infrastructure, implementation of robust quality systems. And now in regards to networks and collaboration, it's very clear that we have an invitation to strengthen this collaborative work between the authorities, between the different actors, and the strengthening of the Pan-American network for the regulation of the pharmaceutical implementations, and also intersectoral encouragement between agencies and industries and patient organizations, and the creation of multinational working groups. And in relation to the dynamics, the harmonization of regulatory frameworks with international standards and the promotion of transparency through policies of access to information and the establishment of surveillance, regulatory surveillance mechanisms. We have gone through this analysis of the regulatory systems and the adoption of good practices. And I think that here we have to highlight that good regulatory practices represent a fundamental guideline to strengthen our regulatory systems. And what we wanted, or what we did in this study, what you will be able to download is here, is essential, like legality, transparency, flexibility, decision-making based on science and data. And here I highlight that we have been given not only a clear vision of an excellent, the search for regulatory excellence, but also a framework to advance towards more efficient systems that are focused on public health and that achieve what we're expecting and what we all need. This report would not have been possible without the commitment and many people and institutions. And I want to thank the team of INOS, whose work has been very, very hard, and they have done this ambitious project. And I also want to highlight the support of the team of FIPHARMA, and they have been leading and supporting the call and the socialization, not only as a strategic partner, but also as a key promoter of this initiative. I also want to thank all the actors who answered our call and who contributed with their knowledge, their experiences, their good propositions and perspectives to be able to build this first report of the Observatory of Good Regulatory Practices. And today, I enthusiastically announce that as of now, we will have the Observatory portal available, and it will be a tool to encourage this dissemination of the adoption of good regulatory practices and that we can have an access and a permanent consultation. And we would also look in the observatory to be frequently generating a few other contents that allow promoting and socializing and adoption of these principles and these facilitators. And in the space that you see here in the QR code, you will be able to download the full report and take a look and do consultations on the findings and recommendations and different data that we have gathered. And well, every step that we take to implement these practices will be an advance towards definitely more resilient health systems for patients that trust the medications that they need, they receive them, that they get them in a timely manner, or also as a region that is positioned as a global reference in regulation and innovation, which is what we should all want to aspire to in our region. Now, once again, thank you so much for your attention, for your commitment, and for being part of this collective effort. And the future of our regulations is in our hands, and I am convinced that together we can turn this into a reality, and we can help us have the answers that public health requires for all of our region. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias al doctor Carlos Felipe Ainos por
Thank
liderar
you,
este estudio junto con
Felipe
FIFARMA y
and Inos, for leading this study with FIFARMA. And we open now the space so you can open up for a few questions. You have the Q&A button on the platform to see if we have time to answer a few of your questions. And we also invite Diego to be able to participate in the Q&A exercise. And over here, we have a first question related to what do you consider is the main challenge for the implementation of good regulatory practices in the countries in Latin America? Well, I'm going to go. I'm going to stick to the results of the study, Brandon. And actually, yes, what the 240 experts in the region have allowed us to conclude is that funding that the regulatory authorities have is a key element, and sometimes we basically focus on what doesn't work. This doesn't work, this other thing doesn't work, you should change this, you should transform this other thing. But it turns out that for this to happen, the authorities need to have adequate funding, and this funding seems scarce in general in the entire region. In a few countries, evidently you will be able to see this later in the country reports, but yes, it's a critical aspect. So the funding is the barrier that we have to insist on, all of us. And I think it's a common purpose, both of the authorities as well as the groups of interest, because that's the only way we can first maintain a good operation, do the work that is done today, but also, and especially, which is our purpose, implement the changes, the modernization and transformation that is required, especially when we go to the second one, where today we can see so many opportunities based on the adequate application processes and the technologies of information, and especially not only just as vehicles to transform each one of the authorities and make them much more efficient, but also to connect everything that happens in the different regions. And it's a collaboration, international collaboration vehicle that is very powerful, that we need to understand and develop. Okay, and I don't know if you'd like to add anything. Yeah, okay, yes. I'd also add that resources are like a constant issue with the regulatory authorities, as we've seen. And in many cases, resource allocation of a regulatory system is strictly related to or is part of the central budget of the government. It includes the institutions or regulatory authorities that have achieved financial autonomy. They're the ones who have been able to implement digitalizations of their systems in a much better way. But while we get to this point, there's another series of strategies or elements to increase this efficiency that sometimes can be undermined by financial resources. And the tools are there, and they're very clear. The use of regulatory reliance mechanisms in different regulatory functions and the shared work among regulators is also an
más
important element to be considered. Also, especially considering that the good reliance practices are directly linked to the good regulatory practices.
Muchas gracias. Por aquí hay una pregunta que se repite y
Thank you so much.
es
Here we have a question that's
la
repeated, and it's
presentación. Ahí les
if they could get
compartimos
the
y al final
presentation.
de este
We
webinar
shared that at the end of the webinar, we will be sending an email
memorias y con la
with
presentación
the
puedan
minutes and the
utilizar.
presentation
Además
so
de
that
tener
you can
acceso
use it.
directamente al
Additional to the
reporte.
direct access to the report and the
Adicionalmente hay
study.
una pregunta, voy a
Additionally, there's a question here
que dice
that says,
si el informe se va a compartir con las
is
agencias
if the report will
regulatorias.
be
Es
shared with the
importante
regulatory
que las
agencies.
agencias cuenten con esa
I think it's
información.
important for the agencies to have this information. Yes, of course.
Por supuesto, es decir, es un
Of
informe
course.
público
It's a public report.
y creemos que así como ha sido
And
como
we
ha sido
believe that,
el mensaje, es de
as the
trabajo y de
message has
conocimiento de
been,
todos, sobre
it's
todo
for
reconocimiento,
work
análisis
and
y
for
sobre todo
everybody's
de que todos
knowledge and
tengamos
analysis, but especially
todas
that we could all say, okay, what can I do?
De acuerdo. Y también
Okay, yes, I
hay
agree. And
varias
also,
solicitudes de poder
there's
repetir esta
several requests
presentación
to
en los
be able to repeat
diferentes
this information among the
países. Ahí
different
la indicación
countries.
es
And
una vez
the
envíen el
indication
documento
here is once
con
the email has
memorias
been
y demás,
sent
pueden
with the minutes and all,
a ese correo con esa
you can reply
solicitud
to that
y
email
se
with that
revisará con calma.
request and we can look it over case by
Hay
case.
más preguntas.
I think there's a few more questions here.
Ahora que ya contamos con este estudio,
Now
¿cuáles son
that
los planes para
we
la
already
continuación
have
del
this study, what are the
protocolo para
plans
contribuir
to
en el avance del
take advantage of this valuable information and continue in the advance of the PPR?
Yo creo que lo primero es
I think that
fortalecer
first thing
la
is to
difusión y
strengthen
lo
the
segundo que creemos que
dissemination. The second thing that I believe is
leer
important
entre
is
líneas
to
dónde están los puntos
read between the lines where we have the
así
points
podemos cada uno
that,
desde
as we
nuestras
said, we can
instituciones
all
ligadas,
from
sea
our
académicas,
institutions, being
sea
it academia or think tanks or industry,
consultores, o sea las mismas
consultants
autoridades,
or
podemos
the actual
hacerlo
authorities,
porque hay
we
muchísimos
can do
elementos
because
accionables para
there's a lot
prácticamente
of
hacer
actionable
planes
elements to basically
de
build
trabajo, planes
work plans
colaborativos.
and collaborative action plans.
Quisiera
And
también resaltar y por
maybe here I'd
razones
like to
de
highlight, and
restricción del tiempo,
obviously because of the
que en el
restriction
full
of
text
time,
ustedes van a encontrar
in the full
algunos
report,
otros
you will
elementos
find
que no
also
entramos
other
en la
elements that we
presentación,
didn't include here in the
nuestros
presentation. And
beneficios.
I believe that one of the elements is
Nosotros
that
hicimos también búsqueda
as a team,
buenas
we
prácticas y
searched for
referencias, además porque nos los
good practices
compartieron
and
los
references because
expertos
they were shared with
y
us
los
also by the
buscamos a
experts.
través de las revisiones,
One, we looked for them through
posteriormente
reviews, the
consultas
literature and all
periódicas
that, and consultations, but others were
que fueron
shared
también
by the same experts that participated and said, these things are happening here. You should think about looking at this reference. So I also want to invite you to consult the references that you will see along the entire report that you will be able to download.
Muchas gracias. Y
Thank you so much. And they're asking us to share once again the QR code at the end of the webinar. We will show you once again so that you can go in again. And there's a question to start closing this meeting, and it's what is the key recommendation of the study that you consider most urgent to strengthen national regulatory authorities?
Carlos, y muchas.
There's many.
Yo más bien quiero responder esa pregunta
And I want to answer this question by inviting you to use the study. It's a study that is long. It has approximately 60 pages. You can put the QR up again on screen, please. And all aspects of the good regulatory practices, principles, facilitators, etc., are interconnected. And it's important to highlight this, and the report says this as well, that all regulators in the region already implement principles and facilitators of good practices in their regulatory systems. The challenge is to continue expanding on the use of these principles, to continue expanding on these practices, and to continue having the international regulatory collaboration and the multi-sectoral collaboration with academia, industry, etc. And this is the main study of the main goal of the study. I also want to take advantage and answer this question here on specific experimentation per country. Yes, there will be white papers, specific reports per country with very detailed specific recommendations for each one of the countries analyzed in this study.
Así es, esta es sin duda
Yes,
una
and
conversación
this is
abierta
undoubtedly an open conversation where we invite all the countries and everybody concerned who has connected to the space to continue with the conversation, to continue with the recommendations, to download the study. We reiterate right now that here on screen we have the QR code so that you can download it, but also to your email where you registered for this webinar, you will be able to find, and we will send you all the instructions and the minutes of the webinar and the recording so that you can use the information. I believe that with this, all we have is left is to thank everybody who connected with us. We had over 350 attendees today. And this shows the commitment and also the interest on this specific subject matter. From Inos and Fifarma, we are completely open to keep tending to and responding to invitations on this specific subject matter. And there's also an invitation to check the web pages of the different institutions and look at the report and each one of the contents and conversations that will be generated in the next few months and weeks, as well as in your social media, where you can find a lot more information on these subject matters in particular. Being at 10 a.m. and also respecting the time that we have proposed for this space, I want to thank you for the invitation, and we hope that you have a great day.
Feliz día para todos.
Gracias.
Thank you so
Feliz
much.
día.
Have a great day, everybody.